midnight screams.
Yesterday, I interviewed and watched the first live test of a man named Clyde. Clyde called himself a doctor, but had no official credentials. What he did have was a lot of money and an obsession with quantum physics. He invited me, a self-employed reporter and science communicator, to come see his latest project. I accepted his offer, gathered my gear, and drove to his remote lab in the mountains. The lab appeared as a lavish summer home any ultra-wealthy man might buy or commission for himself. 3 stories, nice brickwork, too many windows, a pool, and all the amenities one could think of wanting. The only thing there wasn't was staff. Clyde was waiting for me on the front porch to the estate when I arrived alone. I parked, reached to grab my equipment, and then found him opening the door for me. Despite feeling odd at the attentive forwardness, I thanked him, then followed him in at his request. He was a stockier man, looking to be in his early 40s with gray speckled hair and goatee. He wore button sweater vest over a turtleneck and had thin lensed bifocals resting on his round nose. He addressed me by my full name, which told me he had researched me as I had him. I hadn't given him my full name, or anything beyond my pen name. When he did so, he shook my hand, and I noticed his odd gloves. They were a navy, with intense geometric patterning. They were immensely cold to the touch, but not in any painful way. He smiled awkwardly at that and apologized. He showed me inside, entreated me to a light brunch before showing me a few smaller demonstrations. It was at this point that I started the recording, and the following is a transcript of our conversation with provided context. Clyde, are we recording? Yes. Is that okay? I know this is just a few conceptual pieces, but I'd like to document this too for my transcribing later. Clyde. Yes, of course. That's what we're here for today, after all. Right. So, here I have a few things to help me explain what we're doing here today. I'm sure you are, but are you familiar with quantum tunneling? Yeah. It's when something can slip through the empty space of atoms. Clyde, that's not a terrible answer, but it's less about atoms being empty space and more about the method of moving. Let's start here. Clyde walks to the kitchen and grabs a piece of cheese from brunch and places it in an opaque box when he returns to the demonstration display. Clyde, okay. Let's pretend it's been a day or so. Is the cheese moldy? Jenny, are we doing Schrodinger's cat? Clyde, Clyde's cheese, but yes. Sorry. I do love playing what's in my pocket with these things. Jenny, well, teach. It's in a superposition, and is both until observed. Though I'd say it's probably fine at the moment, and will be tomorrow. Maybe gross, but not moldy. Why are we talking superposition? Clyde, particles are also in superposition. They have a waveform and also have mass. They don't settle anywhere until observed. So, if they're a wave, do they have different energy levels when observed? Clyde, you're reading ahead of the class, if I may extend the metaphor. You're right, though. Let's do this example next. Clyde then showed a small, shallow bin of water, with a wall separating the pool in two. He then took out a small metal cube. Clyde, now, this isn't quantum tunneling because we don't have anything with waveform, but I am going to drop this and make waves so we have a visual. Of course, you know that what we're actually seeing is just the waves pushing the wall to make waves on the other side. He dropped the cube during his sentence. The light splash made ripples in its side of the bin, and mostly were contained to its side. The ripples hitting the barrier made much smaller ripples on the opposite side of the bin. Clyde. These smaller waves are like the particles that quantum tunnel. Most of the waves bounce off, but some show up on the other side. Not all the energy made it through, only some. Just like in quantum tunneling, except these waves of energy will never be mass. And you have the opposite problem. You're mass, and can't be energy. Also, if you could have waveform, you don't want to only have a little bit of you tunnel. Both good observations, but I unfortunately don't have a way to show you my solve for that first part. I can show you how I'm going to solve the second part here, however. Clyde then unscrewed a canister that began emitting heavy vapors. He reached in and pulled out a puck pattern the same way as his gloves. He also retrieved the metal cube from the water. Clyde, this here puck is a superconductor, and it works best when it's very cold. This one has been resting in liquid CO2, so it's plenty cold. He placed the cube above it, and it began to float motionlessly above the superconductor. Clyde, this cube is magnetized and is now quantum locked with the superconductor. If I push it, it will return to where it's been locked. Clyde did so, and he could move the cube, but it shunted back to where he'd locked it the moment he let off the pressure. Clyde, my gloves and the rest of the suit down in the lab are both superconductors and quantum lock the very particles that make up my body, so I'm primed for quantum tunneling as soon as I have waveform. That's quite a claim. Clyde, that's why you're here, to see before you believe. The rest of the recording is me asking, clarifying, and follow-up questions. For example, Jenny, why wear the gloves now? Clyde, acclimation to the normally deadly cold takes time, and I don't always want to wait to get hands-on. So I wear these and have a glove wall system to do smaller bits of work. Clyde showed me to the elevator where we rode down to the lab. It was subterranean and was dedicated mostly to his work on quantum tunneling. The exceptions were the bathroom and a photo-developing darkroom. He said it was just convenient to have that hobby space down here as there were no windows, and light to affect photo development. The lab was cold enough that I could see our breath, but Clyde had a heavy coat ready for me on a coat rack. The lab has two main parts, the observation chamber and the testing chamber. The observation chamber had monitors, seats, and a few hundred buttons. It was also the access to the bathroom, darkroom, and testing chamber via pressure lock in the large transparent wall. The testing chamber was a much larger room that had paneling of electromagnets set up like a U-shaped track. There was a small, person-sized capsule made of the patterned material, quantum locked a bit off the ground at the start of the track. At the end was a sturdy-looking wall and a complex system of netting and cushioning behind it. The testing chamber also had a small room in the corner where I could see the rest of Clyde's patterned suit. It looked skin-tight and would likely only ever fit him. There were no mouth or eye holes in the mask. Lastly, there was a smaller, less convoluted monitor and control station. Clyde excused himself to prepare for the experiment, but before he did, he set me up at the monitors. He showed me how to use the intercom, but said once he was in a vacuum, it wouldn't work. He also let me watch recordings of his previous experiments. He stepped into the test chamber and into his changing room. I watched the videos he set for me, a small-scale test where he got one particle to tunnel, then a more impressive test of tunneling a coin. I was blown away. This alone was enough to shake the scientific world. When he stepped out in his geometric patterned suit, I gave him a bewildered look. Only a truly mad scientist wouldn't be satisfied by this monumental achievement. Clyde pressed the intercom and told me he was acclimating and would start depressurizing the chamber while he did. He tossed out a joke about not wanting to catch fire from the air friction. He seemed as casual as ever about the situation. I sat down and waited with worried anticipation. Before I knew it, he was giving me a thumbs up and tapping at his terminal. Things began to hum around me as systems activated. Clyde vaulted up into his quantum-locked capsule and gave me a small wave before closing himself inside. On my monitor, there was a countdown from 20. I didn't feel ready. Suddenly, things were moving along so fast, I tried to catch my anxious breath. Was this crazy? Yes, but all science felt that way at times. Was this too crazy? He had seemed like he understood so much of what he was doing upstairs. 6, 5, 4, 3. The screen counted, and I locked my attention quantum-like to the starting experiment. 2, 1. The electromagnetic tiles flicked like hyperspeed dominoes, and the capsule rocketed at neck-breaking speeds. It whipped around the bend faster than a blink would even allow me to miss. Clyde shot towards the wall, almost seeming to become a flash of light. The capsule slammed into the wall, sending shards and debris scattering. After such speed of action, the crash seemed to be in slow motion. Chunks of failure and disaster embedded themselves around the crash site. I screamed in horror and shock while the entire lab shook. I'd just seen Clyde kill himself trying to quantum tunnel. I frantically rummaged through the terminal functions to pressurize the room, accidentally finding the light controls first. Eventually, I was able to hear the valves activate and waited anxiously for the room to be enterable. The test chamber was colder than ever when I finally made it through the pressure lock. The chilled artificial atmosphere felt sharp in my lungs. I ran to the crash site and found the wreckage simultaneously resembling a stomped soda can and a dropped sheet of ice. However, I could find no blood, bone, or body. I couldn't even find the suit. Confusion flooded me. I looked at the wall. It had held up to the force well enough to be standing. I saw nothing on the other side of it. I went back to the monitor and watched the crash again via the recording. He hadn't just looked like a flash of light. He might have been light. Had he been successful in giving himself a waveform? I looked at the darkroom and got an idea. I grabbed and broke the coat rack to make a walking stick, then plunged myself into darkness via the terminal. I entered the photo development darkroom through the rotating cylindrical door. There was a dim red light within the chamber. I found a closed box with sheets of photo paper. I took a few out of the darkroom and fumbled with my coat rack walking stick to the pressure lock. Back in the test chamber, I placed photo papers around the room. Maybe if he was a waveform, the photo paper would react to him. I let the papers expose for an hour before I couldn't wait any longer in the darkness. I retrieved my photo paper and brought them to the darkroom. There, one by one, I started using the premixed fluids to develop them. The first sheet remained white. The second sheet also failed to react to any light. The third showed no sign of anything. I began to doubt there was hope of learning anything, until I began developing my fourth sheet. Lines and dark spots began to appear on the sheet. Incomprehensible and unrecognizable to me in the dim light, but there was an image as negative developing on the sheet. I finished the process, setting the image. I took it out to the observation chamber and turned the light back on. I looked at the sheet. There on the paper was a contorted, mangled visage of Clyde. The difficult-to-make-out details showed him elongated, warped, and suffering. If any human emotion was left to be read, it was of abject anguish. I'm a woman of the sciences, but I prayed in that moment that he would die and end his quantum suffering. I was so broke, it was pathetic, drained of money, of feeling, of purpose. Maybe it was the stupid choices of my youth. Maybe it was just bad luck. Life tossed me out of high school and onto the streets. Then came the drugs, then rehab, then relapse. I drifted from couch to shelter to squatting in abandoned houses. A steady income? Never heard of it. So when I saw the email, I almost deleted it unread. I figured it was just another rejection letter for one of my hastily written job applications. Then the subject line caught my eye. Dine with me. $50,000. I'm no looker. Even before addiction had chiseled away what few decent features I had, I was nothing special. My eyes were sunken. My skin had forgotten what moisturizer felt like. So the email was absurd. I had no looks, no resume, no reason to be chosen. But I'd just been kicked out of a shelter, and $50,000 was a bigger dream than anything I'd ever dared to have. So I read on. The body of the message was simple. It came from a domain I'd never seen, Shepard K. at skcompunctionfirm.com. Dear recipient, I hope this message finds you well. I am inviting you to dine with me. This is not a romantic proposition. You will be compensated handsomely for your time, provided you follow these conditions. 1. Remain for the entirety of the meal until I have paid the bill and see you out. 2. Do not pay for anything yourself. 3. Dress in formal attire. If you do not have any, a suit will be available at the entrance. It will fit. Any violation will result in the forfeiture of your entire payment. To accept, reply to this email. The time and location will be sent upon your agreement. To decline, simply ignore this message. Well, did it sound crazy? Of course it did, but desperation makes you stupid. The kind of stupid that doesn't need an explanation, just a fork in a chair. So I replied, Hello, Shepard. Thank you for your generous offer. I accept the conditions and will be there. May I ask a few questions about this offer? Thanks again. I didn't expect a response. Maybe it was a scam, maybe it was nothing, but just seconds later, a reply came through. Monday at 6 p.m. at La Fime Justifiée. You may ask your questions during the meal. Thank you for your cooperation. More mystery. That's when a sliver of common sense kicked in, and I decided to look this guy up. It was clearly his work email, so I Googled the S&K compunction firm. I thought it would be some massive law group with a name to match, but no. It wasn't a law firm, just a single office tucked into a low-rent business park. No products, no services, just a single photo of the branch manager. Though the office looked like it could barely fit 2 people, and the title implied there were other branches, none of which I could find. What did they do? Solutions. No other details, just that one word. I thought about backing out. I probably should have, but hesitation is a luxury when you have nothing left to lose. And I had nothing left to lose, so I took the risk. Between drug-induced hazes and a few beatings, Monday crept in like a bruise, a dull, invisible ache that suddenly bloomed into view. I had nothing formal, so I wore my only white button-down and a pair of gray slacks. Both had stains I couldn't explain, and neither had seen an iron in a long, long time. But it was the best I had. None of it mattered. The second I shuffled into the restaurant, the host, if you could call him that, handed me a freshly pressed suit without a word and pointed toward the restroom. I got the message. The suit felt expensive, like real Men's Warehouse stuff. It fit just as the email said it would, perfectly. Too perfectly. The sleeves ended exactly at my wrist bone. The collar hugged my neck like it had always belonged there. I didn't have the time or the money to question it. I stepped out. The restaurant had a strange charm. Soft light spilled onto the white tablecloths like warm, liquid honey. Ornate frames lined the walls, holding abstract paintings that felt oddly familiar. Dark wood paneling covered every surface, and shimmering curtains hung heavy like they would at a wedding. It smelled of fake plants and old fabric. Soft jazz drifted through the air, barely touching my ears. As I scanned the room, a sliver of unease found me. When I'd walked in, there were at least 4 other tables of people, laughing and talking. The place had been loud, alive. But now, silent, empty, as if some bell had rung that only I hadn't heard. There were only a few waiters, the silent host, and a single bald man in a suit that looked identical to mine. I knew who it was immediately. His face was the only thing I'd found when I looked up the domain name. The branch manager. I walked over to his table, and before I could ask if he was waiting for me, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. He was an older man, maybe 50, with heavy-lidded eyes that drooped with a kind of weary sorrow. His nose was so thin it looked like a shark's fin, as if he had no nostrils at all. His jowls vibrated slightly when he spoke, his voice low, even, and gentle. "Thank you for coming, young man. It's a pleasure to finally meet you," he said, extending a hand to shake. I tried to keep my voice steady, though a wave of anxiety was cresting inside me. "Thank you, sir." The conversation that followed was surprisingly pleasant. The food was some of the best I'd ever had. So strangely nostalgic and perfect it felt like it had been cooked just for me. He asked about my childhood, my current line of work, my family. Most of it wasn't pleasant to remember, but it was nice to have someone listen. I started to relax. He never interrupted, never judged. He just watched. Then he grew serious. He took my wrist in his hand just as I was lifting my fork. His hand was ice cold but firm, and his voice dropped. "What is one thing you wish you'd never done?" "What?" I was stunned by the sheer gravity of it. He didn't answer, just stared, unblinking and expectant. I swallowed hard. I stole money from my mother while she was dying. I was supposed to be taking care of her, protecting her. I used it to buy the one thing she begged me to quit. A waiter appeared in silence and placed a small porcelain bowl in front of me. Inside, a single seared scallop rested on a streak of fiery red chili sauce. The red bled against the white plate like the shame I carried. The tender flesh of the scallop gave way in my mouth, leaving a searing heat, a reminder that some wounds never truly heal. A whisper of lime zest lifted the acidity, like a murmur of regret. He nodded, not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding, then stood and excused himself to the restroom. When he was gone, I let out a breath, trying to steady myself. That's when I noticed it. The chandelier. Above us had an extra bulb, just one. The light it cast bent slightly at the edges, elongating the shadows beneath our plates. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, and things returned to normal, mostly. The jazz had slowed, just a fraction. Each note seemed to hang in the air a second longer than it should. He returned, looking slightly different. The right side of his face seemed younger, tighter, while the left side was unchanged. A crease near his mouth was gone, and his smile seemed lighter, as if lifted of some great weight. He asked again, gently, "What is the kindest thing you have ever done?" I told him about a homeless kid I'd let sleep in my car on a freezing winter night. I didn't know his name, didn't expect anything from him. I just locked the doors and stayed awake all night in case someone tried to hurt him. As he listened, another dish was served, a hollowed-out apple filled with warm butternut squash soup. The sweetness was cut by sage oil, the crisp apple, a frame for the velvety soup inside, evoking the way I'd sheltered the boy from the cold. Each spoonful was a quiet promise of safety in a world that offered none. This time, as he listened, his face seemed to react. His left eye grew brighter, and the left side of his face softened. He looked younger. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe the room had actually gotten darker. He asked another question. "What is the worst lie you have ever told?" I hesitated. I'd promised myself I would never revisit it, but I felt compelled to tell this man. When a relative of mine overdosed, I could have saved him. I saw it happen, but I froze, afraid of becoming him. When the cops came, I told them he was already gone when I found him. He nodded again. Still no judgment, just listening. I don't know how, but as I spoke, another dish appeared. A single, translucent, steamed dumpling. The skin so delicate it seemed a whisper would tear it. The moment my fork pierced it, a smoky chili broth erupted, scalding my tongue with a heat that spoke of lies that burn hotter. The wrapper dissolved as if it had never been there, leaving only the searing aftertaste of a secret I thought I'd buried forever. Then he stood and walked away, slower this time. The chair scraped as he left it, and the floorboards beneath it seemed to bow outward in a way that made no logical sense. As I sat alone, I noticed the wallpaper behind the bar began to bulge slightly, as if being pushed from within by a gentle heat. The curtains seemed heavier, and the framed pictures on the walls began to tilt, each in a different direction. Not by much, but enough to notice, enough to wonder. The staff never changed our plates. My water glass refilled itself, and I began to feel something impossible. Everyone in the room had his face, not exactly, but a variation, like a family of clones where each replication introduced a new flaw. The bartender blinked with one bulging eye, and the hostess's smile drooped like melting wax. When he returned, the distortion was more pronounced. His jaw was twisted, one side shrunken and the other stretched taut like wire. The contrast in his face was no longer just physical. It radiated something deeper, as if two halves of a personality were at war. He sat down, his eyes scanning me as if weighing the silence. I couldn't tell if he was judging my soul or just enjoying my fear, the way it was beginning to creep into the corners of my posture. His voice was a soft, almost reverent hum. "What is your most cherished memory?" It took me a moment. Not because I didn't know, but because I was afraid to admit how fragile it now felt. When I was a kid, I used to swim in Lake Michigan every summer. I began slowly. I'd go with my friends. We'd jump off the pier, screaming about lake monsters and cold sandwiches. It was stupid, but I felt safe, like I didn't owe anyone anything. Shepard's right eye, his good eye, glistened. A single tear formed, rolling down the bright side of his face. It pooled at his chin, and then vanished into the folds of his left side, which remained still, sunken, almost hollow. I stared at him, not knowing whether to thank him or run. He said nothing, just stood up even slower than before, his movements deliberate, heavy. The chair groaned as if it hated to be left behind. His trip to the restroom took much longer this time. The silence thickened, and the background music was now almost inaudible. The light from the ceiling was dimmer than before, flickering weakly now. One of the pictures fell crooked. The bartender was polishing the same spot on the counter, his face blank, his one eye bulging slightly. The wallpaper near the entrance had begun to peel, revealing small tendrils writhing out like roots. A fly circled the wineglass next to mine but never landed, its pattern an endless, repeating loop. I felt my chest tighten. Shepard returned. He didn't sit this time but loomed over the table. His face was just wrong now. The symmetry had surrendered. One eye bulged and twitched, the other was sunken deep in its socket. His mouth hung slightly open, but no breath escaped. He was quiet for a few seconds, just observing me. Then, finally, he spoke. "Would you care for dessert?" I stood up, almost instinctively. "I think I need to use the restroom," I said. He nodded slowly. "Take your time." The bathroom was too quiet, the mirror too clear. I leaned in, expecting to see my own ruined reflection, but instead, behind me in the mirror, Shepard was standing there, not in the room, but in the reflection. His form was elongated, taller than before, his suit shimmering like the surface of a lake. He smiled, both of his eyes twitching madly. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just walked back out, numb. The dining room was almost gone. The walls were peeling away, curling up toward the ceiling. The tables and chairs were melting into twisted masses of dark wood and crumpled fabric. The floor rippled like liquid stone. The curtains had vanished completely, leaving a sparkling static where the windows had been. Shepard stood in the center of it, serene. "You did well, young man," he said. "Repentance is never easy. The hardest part is accepting you no longer belong to the world you knew." My knees wanted to buckle. I wanted to argue, to scream, to run, but none of my limbs responded like they used to. Everything had slowed down except him. "What do you mean?" I stammered. He smiled gently, like a father comforting a child who had just asked their last fateful question. "This meal wasn't a reward," he said. "It was a succession." "No," I whispered. "I walked here. I remember the shelter, the email." "You remember the dose," he interrupted, his voice as soft as a razor being drawn across silk. "And the diner bathroom. You remember how cold the tile floor was. Do you remember how long it took for someone to find you?" I shook my head as if I could dislodge the truth, but it was no use. My feet were rooted to the spot. "All we offer," he continued, "is a moment. One last conversation. One last taste. One last confession." The rest of the room dissolved, like ash on the wind. The table before us blinked out of existence. Steam hissed from cracks in the floor that hadn't been there before. Shepard extended his hand again. His suit now had an impossible sheen, its color shifting like moonlight on water. Patterns swirled across the fabric faces or shadows. I couldn't be sure. "You did well," he whispered. "You were honest. That's all we ask." I felt tears on my cheeks, though I didn't know where they came from. What happens now?" Shepard looked over his shoulder. Behind him, the restaurant was entirely gone. replaced by a long corridor of shifting doorways. Some were ajar, some glowed with a warm light, others were dark and sealed shut. "Now," he said, "you choose." Tiny, muffled steps hurried down the hall to our bedroom. They stopped just outside our door as a small hand slowly pushed open the old moaning door. There were more footsteps, then a small hop up onto the foot of the bed, and a clumsy crawl up to right between my wife and I. My daughter, 4, often awakened in the middle of the night to come seeking the safety only a parent's bed can provide. Having recently moved in, my wife and I had been lenient on allowing her to come and sleep with us. New houses come with new sounds to get used to, new shadows to puzzle out in the dark. And though this house was new to us, it was actually quite old. There was no shortage of creaks and groans pervading the century-old floorboards and walls. We understood the transition would take some time and she may feel uncomfortable for a while, but it wasn't a habit we wanted to encourage forever. Eventually we would resume the ritual of returning her to her bed at whatever ungodly hour she had come in. Not tonight, though. Exhausted from a long day of wrangling in our new yard that the old owner had let go feral, I laid facing the wall, with my back to my daughter, implementing my recent strategy of ignoring her until she was dead asleep. Given the slightest bit of attention, even in the middle of the night, my daughter would have trouble finding sleep again. But fortunately, she settled in under the comforter and was quiet. I closed my eyes, hoping I could also go back to sleep quickly. About half a minute passed, then tap, tap, tap. Cold, tiny fingers poked my shoulder. I groaned, eyes still closed. Couldn't give her too much. She brought her arm back down quickly, but didn't say anything. My wife stirred on the other side of the bed. I tried to fall asleep again. I was just dozing off when I heard a thin and raspy voice mutter, "Daddy?" "Huh," I grunted, coming to in a start but still half asleep. Her voice sounded a bit off, the way some sounds do when you're teetering on the edge of a dream, not sure which side of sleep it came from. I lay still, continuing my strategy. She said nothing else, and I was finally able to fall back to sleep. It was still dark outside when she kicked me with her little foot right in the back. I jolted awake and nudged her legs away, straightening her out. I reached over and tapped my phone on the bedside table to check the time. Through blurry eyes, I could see it was still a couple hours until morning. Deciding that I needed to get some good rest before another long day of yard work, I stood, then reached down and scooped up my daughter to take her back to her room. I managed to find my way down the hall to her room in the dark, trying to keep my eyes mostly closed so as not to wake up too much. Nudging open her moaning door with my shoulder, I saw moonlight shining through the bedroom window, illuminating my daughter's bed. Laying there, snuggled up under her covers with her doll, was my little girl, fast asleep. I froze, confused with what I was seeing. I blinked hard to clear away the haze of sleep. I slowly dipped my head to see who I was holding, and as the blurriness cleared, I saw another small girl, about my daughter's age, staring up at me with yellow eyes from sunken sockets. Cool moonlight illuminated horrible gray skin and thin tendrils of black hair. She looked frozen at first, then her lips parted slowly in a grin, revealing dirty brownish teeth. She wore a filthy nightgown with ruffles around the collar, and I became vividly aware of the scrawny, bony body beneath it. The dead girl giggled with her raspy voice, and I dropped her, letting out a shriek of terror. She hit the floorboards with a thud, then hopped to her feet and scurried out the door into the darkness, giggling as she went. I listened to her tiny footsteps fade away down the hall. "Daddy?" I inhaled sharply as I turned to look over at my daughter's bed, realizing I hadn't been breathing. She was propped up on one arm, wiping the sleep out of her eyes with the other hand. "Hey," I said, barely able to squeak it out. I stepped over and scooped her up, then walked over to her doorway. I stood there for a moment listening, building the courage to step out into the hall. My room was only about 10 steps away, but it felt like a mile. Finally, fairly certain the hall was empty, I took the first step. The second one came easier, and soon I was in an all-out sprint, sure the dead girl was right behind me. I made it to our bed and placed my daughter down in the middle next to my wife, where she fell fast asleep. I lay still next to her until the sun came up, wide awake, eyes fixed on the dark hallway, listening for footsteps. It was either joining a gym or taking up hiking. I wish I had joined a gym. After my breakup with Carl, and after a much-needed period of shameless self-pity and wallowing, I knew that I needed to do something positive, get active again, and feel good about myself. I decided on hiking for a couple of reasons. I had never been an outdoorsy type, and I wanted to prove to myself that I could challenge myself. I had gotten so comfortable, too comfortable, I suppose, in my relationship. It was time to get out of my comfort zone. Plus, I liked the idea of the solitude hiking would bring me. I needed time to think and reflect. Well, let's just say I didn't get that part right, but I definitely found myself out of my comfort zone, way out of my comfort zone. After spending far too much on a pair of hiking boots, a day pack, and some other hiking gear, none of which would come in useful, as you'll see, I chose a trail about a 45-minute drive away from where I lived. I arrived early at the trailhead. The air was crisp and fresh, renewing even. I went inside the small ranger's station to sign in. Greeting me were two men, an older one with bushy gray eyebrows and gray hair in a ponytail, and a younger one, probably closer to my own early 30s age with dark, slicked-back hair. "Good morning," said Ponytail cheerily. "Lovely morning for a hike." I'd have to take his word for it, since this was my very first time hiking, but I smiled back cheerfully as he handed me a pen to sign the visitor's register. Ponytail explained a couple of rules to me. Stay on the designated path, leave and take nothing. And then he said something that made me pause. Now, we've been having a bit of a problem with a vagrant in the park, a woman. She's been hassling a few of the hikers. We don't know. He was cut off from the sound of a phone ringing in a room to the back of the reception area. He held up a finger to signal he'd be right back. This entire time, Slick had been sitting behind the counter on stool, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He hadn't said a word until Ponytail left. "Listen here," he said quietly. "That's no woman in the park. He knows it," he said, pointing at Ponytail on the call in the other room. "And I know it. What I am about to say might make you turn around and head straight for your car, but if it doesn't, and you still want to do the trail, then you've got to be careful." He kept his voice low, seemingly to keep Ponytail from overhearing him. "If you see her, or it, or whatever, it'll be in a tree. She's always in the trees. She'll try talking to you. Don't engage. Try not to even look up if you hear a voice coming from the trees, but if you can't help it, whatever you do, don't talk back to it. Just pretend it's not there, and walk back to the trailhead, and get in your car and drive away. If you see her a second time, then run. If she starts climbing down from the tree, then pray." I stared at Slick in shock, my mouth slightly open, not sure if I should start laughing or screaming. "I'm only telling you this," he continued, "because, no offense, I can see you're probably not the most experienced hiker." He looked me up and down, clocking my obvious never-used boots and Pack's waist belt harnessed too tightly around my middle. "And she seems to target people like you. The thing is, it looks like she's not just observing anymore, but—" He stopped abruptly as Ponytail came back into the room. Slick stared at me, his expression serious. "Right," said Ponytail. "Sorry about that. Now you have enough water?" "The round trip takes about 4 hours to complete. Maybe 5 if you're, not walking too fast. Or, not used to the trail." I nodded, my head still spinning. Now, of course, this is the part I should have turned around and headed straight for my car. But the problem is, I'm terribly stubborn. With Ponytail's implied and Slick's outright judgment of my experience as a hiker, I was very determined to prove them wrong. In fact, 10 minutes into the hike, I had convinced myself that Slick was just trying to scare me off, because he probably thought my inexperience would become a problem for him, like I'd be dumb enough to go off trail or try pet a mountain lion. 30 minutes in, I noticed my boots began to hurt my feet a little. An hour in, the air had turned from crisp and refreshing to thick and oppressive, and the big toe on my left foot was absolutely throbbing. I didn't know how much determination I had left to keep me going forward. I found a bench a couple of minutes later and sat down. I immediately took off my boot and sock and examined the large, raw blister forming on my toe. I hadn't brought a first aid kit and was cursing myself as I took a large gulp of water from my bottle. All of a sudden, I can't describe this any other way, I felt the presence of another person and instinctively looked at the trail. Sure, I'd see another hiker making their way around the bend, but there was no one. I held my breath, waiting. The forest was unnaturally still and quiet, as if it were holding its breath and waiting with me. And then I jumped violently as a group of blackbirds exploded out of a tree a ways down from where I had just come from, cawing angrily as they flew away. Maybe it was the pain, or the discomfort from the heat, or maybe I had started feeling spooked by what Slick had said, but I decided to get out of there, pulling my sock and boot on and packing away my water bottle in record speed. It would take me another hour to get back to my car, maybe a little longer as I had started limping a bit to keep the weight off my left foot. I still had the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone, that any minute another hiker would appear on the path. Instead, I heard a soft hello from above. I did look. Of course I did. Anyone would. What I saw was an extremely thin, pale woman sitting on a low branch in the tree above me. Her arms were hugging the trunk, and it took me a moment to realize they must have been impossibly long, because they wrapped around the thick trunk almost entirely. My hands wouldn't have even met each other if I were to do it. Her fingers were long and splayed against the bark, ending in long, dirty nails. Her face will be burned into my memory forever. Her skin was so pale, almost completely white, and her eyes were a light, milky blue, too big and too wide apart. She had long, stringy, blonde, almost white hair. She was completely naked. "Are you in pain?" she asked in a cracked, wispy voice, and then she started smiling. I expected to see fangs in her mouth. Instead, she had the tiniest teeth, spaced apart in swollen pink gums, but they were sharp and pointy, like a crocodile. As her smile got wider and wider at my shock, I felt adrenaline fill my body. Slick's words echoed through my mind. Head back to the trailhead and get to my car. My heart pounding, my neck slick with sweat, I started walking, briskly, unsure if turning my back towards her was a terrible idea. I felt her eyes on me. I walk-jogged, gritting my teeth through the pain for what could have been 5 minutes or 50. Please, God, I thought, don't let me see her again. My mind tried to reconcile with what it had just witnessed, but I pushed the thoughts out of my head. Worrying about that would dull my senses, and I sure needed all my wits about me to make it back to my car. It was impossible, but somehow she made it to a tree ahead of me. I stopped and felt my heart drop as a pale leg appeared from the thick canopy of a tree just 20 feet ahead, and then another leg appeared. She was climbing down. I started running, ducking as I flew past the tree she was coming down from. A long arm swooped down as I passed, but I managed to dodge her grabbing claws. I looked back and saw that she was at the bottom of the tree on all fours. Her propositions were human, but so wrong. She began to scuttle towards me, like a crab, with short, fast steps. She was covering ground at an alarming rate, and I knew there was no way I could outrun her. I made it to a clearing that I remembered was close to the parking lot. If I could just last 5 more minutes, I could maybe get to safety. And then I tripped, pain searing through my already bloody and blistered toes as they collided with a rock. I landed on my hands with a thud and waited for the inevitable. I was so sure it was about to happen that I could almost feel her collide with me. But nothing. Still on my hands and knees, I shakily turned my head. She was still there, on all fours, but stopped. She let out an animal-like shriek but didn't come any closer. It took me a while to register. She wouldn't come into the clearing. She was staying in the shade of the trees, prowling, looking for a way to get to me. The sunlight seemed to be what had saved me. A million thoughts played out in my mind. I could stay in the clearing until someone else came along. But what if they couldn't help me? What if no one came at all? It would eventually get dark. I knew that after the clearing, for about 300 yards, the path was shaded by trees again before the trailhead. Could I make it if I sprinted? With stomach-churning dread, I knew I would have to try. I kept my eyes on her and started backing up, slowing. She stayed at the shade's edge, watching me, evaluating what I was doing. 200 feet until the path became shaded again. 100. 50. 10. And then I turned around and started sprinting. The trail crested and I could see the parking lot. I didn't feel relieved. I wasn't safe yet, but I could see safety, and so I allowed myself to hope. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of white. I turned and saw her bounding towards me through the trees. She had come around and was looping towards me. At the speed she was going, I was sure she'd get to me before I made it off the path. Somehow, I managed to push myself, and I heard her shriek again, a sound of pure, animalistic frustration and hunger, as I made it back into the sunlight of the parking lot. I flew past the ranger station and fumbled with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped them. I managed to unlock my car and get in, locking it again. I started the engine and put it into reverse, swinging out of my parking bay without even looking. Slick came running out of the station, a look of shock and suspicion on his face. I rolled down my window a fraction and yelled at him to go back inside and lock the doors. He hesitated for only a second and then hurried back inside, closing the door behind him. I didn't stop trembling for the entire 45 minutes it took me to get home. I don't know what she was. I don't know what she wanted, or what she was going to do to me if she had caught me. What I do know, though, is that after that one and only hike, I've never felt safe again, and I have never shaken off the feeling of being watched. I keep my lights on at home, all the time. I avoid the shade, my shadow now a thing of safety and comfort.